the back of the room. This is Peter Schiff. He is a candidate for Senate. Yep.
Anyway, well, thanks for inviting me here to speak today. Yeah, I'm a candidate for the United States Senate, and before I talk about why I'm running, let me give you a little bit of background about who I am and how I came to be here in Connecticut. Now, I was actually born in New Haven. I lived here for the first 5 years of my life, and my parents divorced, and so my mother ended up moving out of the state, and we lived down in Florida. We lived in Manhattan. We lived out in California. My mom worked and supported my brother and myself. She got a little help from my dad with child support, but most of it was from my mother. And I stayed out in California for most of my life. I went to college out at UC Berkeley. I was actually one of the only people there. I had a full-size poster of Ronald Reagan in my dorm room, and didn't win me any friends out there. But anyway, when I got out of college, I got into the investment business, and one of my first real jobs was at a major Wall Street brokerage firm that recently failed. Fortunately, I left long before that happened, so it's certainly not my fault, but I was there. And I didn't stay there very long. I was there for a while, and I quickly discovered that retail investors were just not getting a fair shake on Wall Street. I didn't like the advice that they were getting. I just thought it was tainted, and I thought there were a lot of conflicts of interest. So I went out and I started my own firm. I started in my one-bedroom apartment that I lived in downtown Los Angeles, and I started cold calling from my living room. And early on, I mean, one of the things that I noticed relatively soon into that venture, or at least a year or two into it, was the NASDAQ bubble, and I became very concerned that investors were being foolishly led to overpay for stocks that were really, I thought, scams, and I was very much trying to sound the alarm on the NASDAQ, in particular the internet stocks. And so I was cold calling, I was working all day long, trying to convince people to sell these stocks. And it was difficult to do. Most people didn't want to hear it. I got a lot of arguments with people on the phone who were certain that their stocks would go forever, and they thought I was crazy to try to recommend the types of stocks I was recommending, which were solid dividend-paying stocks, old economy stocks, basic industries, a lot of industrial companies. I was recommending oil and gas companies, mining companies, REITs, utilities. Nobody wanted to hear about those types of stocks. They wanted these internet stocks. Anyway, when the bubble finally burst, 2000, 2001, I had a pretty good reputation built up among a lot of people that I had called. Many people followed my advice and got out of the NASDAQ, and were very thankful that they did. A lot of people didn't follow my advice, but they remembered it, because I reminded them. And and so I built up a lot of clients, and my business started to grow in 2001 and 2002. I was getting a lot of calls. My business was growing, so I started hiring people. Up until 2001, 2002, I had no employees. It was just me, and I owned a brokerage firm, but it was just me. Today, I have 6 offices. I have over 100 employees, 15,000 customers all around the world, and the way I kind of made my reputation is, as I started to become concerned about the policies coming out of Washington to try to reflate the economy, to try to artificially stimulate the economy after the NASDAQ bubble burst, I thought that there should have been a more severe recession in the aftermath of all those malinvestments. But I saw the policies coming out of Washington that were very short-sighted. The Fed slashed interest rates down to 1%. We ran budget deficits, and we tried to pump the economy up with Keynesian policies. And I knew that that was going to produce a disaster. And as I saw the extent to which the housing bubble began to inflate, and I was an observer, because at that time I was already renting my house, and I saw all the crazy loans that were being made, and I knew that this was going to end badly. I knew that real estate was way overvalued, which meant our financial system was going to collapse once real estate prices went down. And I knew that was going to happen, and I knew that it would bring in a very severe recession, and I was afraid that the government would try to artificially stimulate the economy in the aftermath of that recession in exactly the way it had done it following the bursting of the NASDAQ bubble. So I began to warn my clients that, hey, we got to get out of US dollars. This is going to be a disaster. And I started buying a lot of commodity stocks, a lot of gold stocks. I was investing abroad. I was investing in Asia. And I started going on television. In 2004, 2005, I think I made my first appearance on CNBC, and they started calling me Dr. Doom. And this is before anybody even knew who Mira Rubini was. And so I was on, twice a week on CNBC, and then I started going on Fox. I was doing their Saturday morning shows, and I was doing a lot of Fox. I was doing CNN. I was doing Bloomberg. I was going on television all the time. And then I wrote a book, which finally came out in 2007, called Crash Proof: How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse. And I wrote about this coming financial disaster, the bursting of the real estate bubble, the fact that Fannie and Freddie would go bankrupt, that our financial system would implode, that we would have the worst recession since the Great Depression, that we would have a massive credit crunch, and that the government was going to try to interfere by printing money, bailing everybody out, propping up housing prices artificially. And of course, when I was warning about this, when I was, sounding the alarm, nobody thought it was possible. People would snicker, would make fun of me, would call me names. But in the process, I built up a pretty good following, particularly in 2008. Once, a lot of my predictions started to come true, people started to notice it. And one thing, now that we didn't have in the past is when people said foolish things on CNBC a few years ago, nobody remembered it. But now with the internet, with YouTube, it's all there. And so there's a lot of videos of me. There's 20,000 different videos of all these shows I did. I mean, I did hundreds and hundreds of shows over the years. One particular fan of mine put together a compilation that he called Peter Schiff Was Right, and it actually went viral, and so far over 1.6 million people have seen that particular YouTube video. And I think what made that one so compelling was that every time I made a forecast, which has now already come true, but of course when I was saying it in 06 and 07, it hadn't happened yet, but everything I said, somebody made fun of me and called me a name or laughed at me, and so I think that's what really drove people to that video. But as a result of that, and the fact that we live in Connecticut, and Chris Dodd was up for election, about a year ago, there was a movement to draft me to run for the United States Senate. A lot of people who have been following me thought this was a perfect race for me because, after all, Chris Dodd is Chris Dodd. And, look at his role in the financial crisis. If anybody is the poster boy for the crisis, it's him. And, I'm the guy that warned about it. I'm the guy that forecasted. So it seems like it would be an ideal race for me to run against Chris Dodd. So they started this draft movement. And initially, I kind of ignored it for the first 6 months. It wasn't the thing I wanted to do. I was focusing on my business, which is actually booming as a result of all the foolish policies coming out of Washington. So I was concentrating on my business. But after a lot of thought and thinking about what they wanted me to do, I thought that it really was an opportunity for me to do something to try to change the course that the nation is on. Up until now, I've been warning people about it, I've been writing about it, but I've mainly been focusing on trying to protect individuals from these policies or try to profit from the things that Wall Street was doing, whether it was shorting subprime mortgages through a hedge fund or just buying gold or buying overseas stocks. I was just trying to find a way to profit from it. But I think it's much better if I can actually go to Washington and put a stop to it. And that's what I'm trying to do, and that's why I'm running for the United States Senate, because I don't think there's anybody there at this point that really understands the nature of the crisis. Unfortunately, government is trying to use the crisis to their advantage. They're trying to scare us into believing that the reason we had this collapse was because of a lack of regulation, that we just had too much freedom and too much capitalism, and if we only had more government and more government control, then it wouldn't have happened. And nothing could be further from the truth. The reason that I saw this crisis with crystal clarity in advance was because I understood how government was creating it. It was government policy, it was Fed policy, and it was congressional regulation that distorted the free market. The free market would have prevented all this from happening. It was the government that short-circuited the market. The government force-fed cheap credit into the economy through the Federal Reserve. The government guaranteed mortgages and guaranteed other loans that never would have been made absent those government guarantees. So the government got people to do things that the free market never would have allowed them to do. And I saw this happening, and I knew how government intervention was blowing up this bubble. And unfortunately, when the recession finally hits, when the bubble finally bursts, this is the free market's way of trying to correct all the mistakes that were made during the boom. That's what the politicians don't understand. That the bust was the boom was the problem. That's when we were drunk, right? When George Bush talked about the fact that Wall Street was drunk, yeah, they were drunk, but they were drunk on government alcohol. And when they